afternoon, everybody, and on behalf of the CCBE, I'd like to welcome you to this session on national security, free license for government surveillance, ? The CCBE is the Federation of Bars and Law Societies of Europe. It's got in total 45 members of bars and law societies of various kinds, and together through those societies represents over 1 million European lawyers. I'm Iain Michiel. I'm the chair of the Working Party on Surveillance of the CCBE, of which I think you'll hear a little bit more later. Our particular concern in the CCBE is both generally for privacy rights for individuals, but also very specifically for the right to legal professional privilege in the common law countries and professional secrecy in other states, which is, as an aspect of privacy, something which is seriously under attack throughout the world and, frankly, always has been. Which brings us really to what our topic is about today, because we have a highly elaborate international structure, all designed to create a functioning, open, democratic society founded on the rule of law, respecting individual and societal rights. We have it in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, and in many national laws and constitutions. And the essential problem that lies behind this structure is that human rights belong to individuals. We all of us have a right to privacy. We all of us have a right to family life, however you characterize it. We all of us have a right to a fair trial. But equally, it is the first obligation to its citizens and duty of the state to provide collective security for its citizens, and all of us as citizens have a right to be kept safe. This creates an astonishing tension. There's a pull always towards national security. And how often have you heard the siren voices saying, if you haven't done anything wrong, you've got nothing to be afraid of? But what I think we want to explore today is how really should this national security issue pan out? And the biggest problem we've got is that there is no single or even multiple definition of what national security actually means. The CCBE did a survey of 11 of its members a couple of years ago. We discovered that of those 11, only Spain had an actual definition of national security in its constitution. The United Kingdom, of course, doesn't have a written constitution. There's nothing in legislation, and there have been attempts in the courts to put some kind of, in case law, boundaries on what national security might be. But when the Investigatory Powers Bill, now the Act, was going through Parliament, there was an amendment, number 236A, proposed by Baroness Jones in the House of Lords, to define national security in this wise. National security means the protection of the existence of the nation and its territorial integrity or political independence against force or the threat of force. She was forced to withdraw that, and the government's view was expressed by Earl Howe, who said the following: "It has been the policy of successive governments not to define national security in statute. National security is one of the statutory purposes of the security and intelligence agencies. Threats to national security are, as we have heard, constantly evolving and difficult to predict, and it is vital that legislation does not constrain the security and intelligence services in their ability to protect the public from new and emerging threats." I think that the key point is that to define national security in statute could have the unintended effect of constraining the ability of the security and intelligence agencies to respond to new and emerging threats to our national security. Well, in Western democracies governed by the rule of law, we may be more or we may be less comfortable about that approach. We remember, after all, if you come in from North Korea, I have no doubt that the beloved leader's hairstyle is a matter of national security. And lest we get too complacent in the West, in Western functioning democracies about it, although the EU doesn't do national security, it's a matter for member states' sovereignty, there is a very unfortunate problem with the access to a lawyer directive, and that is, a little bit of background on the European Convention. Article 8 is the right to privacy, and that is a conditional right, and one of the factors to be taken account in proportionality is indeed national security, undefined. Article 6, the right to a fair trial, is, however, an unqualified right. And we find there in the access to a lawyer directive a substantive provision which guarantees the right for privacy and communication with lawyers, but a narrative which says, but this is without, in the introduction, that this is without a prejudice to issues of national security. So, as I come to introduce the panel, I would like to suggest that as the overarching question, should we be concerned about this tension, or are we perhaps allowing our dystopian visions of 1984 colour our approach to keeping us all safe? To discuss this and other questions, I'd introduce our panelists. And we've got Michiel Pestman, who is a human rights lawyer in Prakken d'Oliveira. Michiel has a connection with the CCBE because the very first intervention the CCBE did in this field was in support of Prakken d'Oliveira's challenge in the Dutch courts about having been placed under surveillance by the Dutch security services. I'm happy to say a successful challenge. We have got Florence Reynal, who's the head of international and European affairs at the CNIL in France. We've got Sophie Veld, member of the European Parliament, who's, I'm sure, well known to you. And our moderator is Joseph Cannataci, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. So, can I kick things off by saying, should we actually take seriously the warning uttered by the well-known Irish lawyer and a politician, John Philpott Curran, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Iain. So the run of play today is expected to be that after I make a short introduction, then we're granting 6-7 minutes each to members of the panel. And after that, we open the floor for discussion. We'd like to encourage as much interactivity with the audience as possible. And I think to a certain extent, we won't be surprised if we find that our panel is full of good news, very much like life, full of good news and full of bad news, right? And it then depends as to whether you were born with the optimism gene inside you as to how you're going to handle it. Let's look at the bad news a bit in my introduction. And I have to deal with this, as you have heard, with just over 190 countries around the world, including, of course, the United States, Russia, China, the UK, France, the Netherlands, and many other places. And it's very much like the film The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, right? But even with the good, it isn't as good as we would want it to be, right? So that is one of our primary concerns. Because Iain has very kindly, in his introduction, pointed out the problem of definition. And the problem of definition is one which, in reality, wherever I go around the world, it seems that national security is whatever the government of that country decides it to be, right? So, starting off from that basic reality which stares us in the face every day, let's come for a minute to Europe and see how that's being handled. Iain has already referred to, directly to Article 4, subsection 2 of the European Treaty, which has national security as a reserved matter for the nation and not for the European, not for the EU as such. I'm not going to go into that debate, which can be a very long one. But all I'm going to say is that apart from the fact that the European Court of Justice has taken quite a number of interesting positions when it comes to matters which relate to national security, the good news is that all the same members of the European Union, all the 28 countries, those which are Brexiting or not included, have also signed the Council of Europe's Convention 108, which in Article 8 very clearly includes the words state security as opposed to national security, but which are quite close in meaning and which I have no doubt that the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg won't trip over itself in order to give even more meaning to the words. So it's not as if the European countries are living in a vacuum, but the truth is, when you look at the laws of those countries, whether the 28 member states of the EU or the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, you don't have homogeneity, you don't have high standards in most countries. You have an attempt in some countries, including the Netherlands, including France, including the United Kingdom, including a number of others, but a very small number of others, who are trying to define better standards of oversight of intelligence when it comes to national security. It's very much work in progress. I'm personally engaged with those governments trying to make sure that we, as we were taught in primary school, let the good be better and let the better become best, because we still have work to do in various areas with those governments. But to be fair, there's a whole bunch of European governments who are nowhere near the stage of properly defining this. So this is something that we're trying to fix. Part of the good news, too, is that Europe's largest project on internet and privacy, the mapping project, which I also happen to coordinate wearing my EU hat, has been working, and lately officially with my UN mandate, on developing a new legal instrument. A new legal instrument which deals with surveillance and privacy in cyberspace. I won't have the time to go into it, but all I can say is that after more than 2 years' work, and it's now online, if you want to go to my UN website, you can find it there, but also on the mapping website, you'll find the concerns of people which we have consulted with. So anybody who says that their privacy, and increasingly their privacy in cyberspace, where most people find themselves today, people are concerned. People would like us to do something about it. We don't have a comprehensive legal framework internationally which deals with it, and we are still in positions where we find countries, including the United States, including European countries, having to deal with each other on one of the key problems, which is jurisdiction, right? And one of the key problems we have internationally is what happens if a citizen whose nationality is unknown has data sitting on a server in Ireland under EU law, but yet somebody decides, a law enforcement agency in the United States decides to go to a court in the United States and tries to somehow pressure a US company, in this case Microsoft, it's public domain, in order to handle the data over, irrespective of whether the data is of an EU citizen, non-US person, etc. My mandate has just intervened in the US Supreme Court with an amicus curiae brief, trying to breathe sense into the whole procedure, because lawyers, what do lawyers need in this case? They also need clarity, as the citizen needs clarity, and we don't have clarity. Because at this moment in time, we have a number of serious issues when it comes to jurisdiction, and citizens, and I'm tired of saying this, but I'm going to have to keep on saying it, in an internet without borders, citizens expect remedies without borders, they expect safeguards without borders, and remedies which go across borders. I'll repeat that. Safeguards without borders and remedies which go across borders. And politicians would be failing in their duty not to try to work towards that. I don't wish to make too much time but we have limited time, but I've been asked to provide this short introduction. This is not to say that places like the United States do not have safeguards. They do have safeguards. The question is, are those safeguards enough? Can they be improved? I'm already on record in June of this year of saying clearly to the United States, good, you've got 40 years head start over a number of other countries, but you're not where you should be yet. So there's more work to be done there yet. But let's see what our panelists would like to say about this. And I'm going very much to go in the order of lawyer, politician who has long made a name in fighting for privacy rights, and then with my friend Florence, who's a professional fighter for privacy inside the French CNIL. So shall we go that way, right? Michiel, would you like to start and address the audience? Thank you. I'm going to get my phone for the simple reason that I forgot my watch, so I have to keep looking at those 7 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm not only a lawyer in the Netherlands, a criminal defense lawyer, but I'm also a victim of national security. I'm here also as a victim, and I was asked to explain or to tell about my experience with the Dutch intelligence services. Approximately 4 years ago, I received information from an anonymous source that the telephones of our office in Amsterdam were being tapped by the intelligence services and had been tapped for a considerable time. Dutch intelligence services had been listening to our telephone conversations we had, among others, with our clients. We are known in the Netherlands for defending political activists, opposition groups in the Netherlands, but also abroad, and also alleged terrorists. So we've always had the attention of the Dutch intelligence services. And of course, when we heard this, we were not happy. Violation of my professional privilege or my professional security and violates my rights under Article 8 of the European Convention, and also the rights of my clients. The rights of my clients to their privacy, but also to a fair trial, a fair criminal trial, as the European Court has established on numerous occasions. The first thing we did was complain with the Interior Minister in the Netherlands, and the Interior Minister in the Netherlands is responsible for the Dutch intelligence services. Not the military intelligence service, but the ordinary ones, the ones that were actually tapping our phones. And the response was, not surprisingly, very disappointing. The interesting thing was that the Interior Minister, acknowledged that our phones were being tapped, but that in the interest of national security and in accordance with existing laws and regulations, to a large extent secret, they were simply allowed to do so. And he was correct. He had a point, because in our provisions or in our law and regulation, there's no provision which expressly mentions the term lawyer with regard to the tapping of phone calls or the reading of confidential emails. Dutch intelligence services, Dutch AIVD, were allowed to listen to our conversations without any form of independent judicial oversight, just like ordinary citizens. The decision to tap a lawyer is taken by the services, the intelligence services themselves. And in certain special cases, the minister, interior minister, has to give permission. But there's no judge or no independent judicial body that looks or controls the work of the intelligence services. With the support of, among others, the European Bar, we went to court to complain and ask for this tapping of our firm to stop, and the introduction of an independent judicial body to control the work of the intelligence services. And to our utter surprise, the Dutch government did everything to stop us. And the argument was simply put that the tapping of confidential phone calls between lawyer and client was absolutely necessary to prevent terrorist attacks in the Netherlands. Because, even worse, lawyers could not be trusted, and the introduction of an independent judicial body would seriously endanger national security. It was seen as an unnecessary bureaucratic interference in the work of the intelligence services. Fortunately, we won in first instance. The government appealed, of course, and we fortunately won again. And all our wishes were granted, so this is a story with a happy ending to a certain extent. The wishes which were supported by the European Bar. And now we have a law which will come into force, a law that is criticized for other reasons, but which offers special protection to lawyers and, more importantly, even our clients. Without prior authorization of a court, the court in The Hague, the intelligence services are no longer, or will no longer be allowed to listen to our private and confidential conversations. And I do not believe, as the government has always argued, that the Netherlands will become a less safer place because of it. The moral of this story is that the government, as happened in the Netherlands, will always use all the power it has or is given to try to stretch the parameters of the law and infringe upon the rights of citizens, our clients, including the rights of lawyers, unless it is expressly forbidden to do so. As far as governments and intelligence services are concerned, there's no such thing as unsolicited self-restraint when national security is at stake. And that is why I think it is important that we soon come up with a workable and narrowly defined definition, international definition of the term national security. And that we keep pushing, wherever possible and whenever possible, for independent judicial oversight. We cannot allow government institutions such as the intelligence services to be judge, jury, and executioner in their own case. And that would make every definition of the principle of national security pointless. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michiel. Well, as you can see, we have had reference to the new Dutch law, about which a referendum, I understand, is to be held. One of the things where I think I'm going to be provocative, even before Sophie comes in, is to say, almost more important than the definition of national security is actually your point about the oversight authority. because if you have an efficient, independent, and well-resourced oversight authority, I'm going to emphasize that, efficient, independent, and well-resourced, right? The term judicial, I would say, could be taken on only in those countries where judges are independent and enjoy tenure. There are a number of countries around the world, unfortunately, where a judge who is seeking to be reappointed could be far too keen to please the government of the day, and rather than come in heavily. But we get your point about the judicial level of independence, especially for those countries where the judiciary enjoys tenure in a very secure way. But Sophie, why don't you come in on this and give us your perspectives?
Yes, thank you very much. You talked about optimism in your introduction, and you talked about some countries who get it right and some countries who do not yet get it right. I'm an optimist by nature, otherwise I wouldn't be in politics. But I'm not so optimistic about the actual situation in the world. I don't think that there are many countries that get it right. I think there are many countries who do not get it right and many more countries who don't get it at all. There are very, very few countries, maybe even none, who get it absolutely right. Now, about the definition of national security, I want to highlight two aspects of that. One is the general definition, how do we use it in practice, what does it mean, national security, and then zoom in on the situation of the European Union, if there is a definition, and how it's being used. The point about national security is that whatever the definition is, national security creates a carve-out from the normal rules. The normal rules don't apply in the area of national security. And normal rules, I mean things like citizens' rights, rule of law standards, transparency, accountability, oversight, and the things that have been mentioned. In the particular EU case, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, for example. So it is very important to keep the definition as narrow as possible, because all those rights and the transparency, accountability are a vital part of our democracy. So the wider the definition of national security, the weaker and the smaller the area of the democratic rule of law. Now, to begin with the aspect, what does that mean, national security? The thing is that it's being used in a very loose manner, increasingly so. First of all, security. Security sounds nice. I like security. I don't think there's anybody who doesn't like security. But security of whom and what? You already mentioned the difference between state security and national security. And very often I get the impression, but you know, with the absence of a definition, we don't know, that it's about security of people, of individuals. But then I would say, if I see all the means invested in the fight against terrorism, which has been justified by national security, that's not a very effective way of providing security, because there are other areas where the same investment might actually save many more lives, like fighting domestic violence. You know, I never tire of mentioning the number of an average of 2,500 women who are beaten to death by their partners every year in Europe alone. So many more. Or if you would invest the same money in, say, healthcare, or even just fighting maternal mortality, you would save many more lives. So what is it what does it mean, security? And national security is something which is clearly more important. But I see many, many cases that are labeled as a matter of national security, which are actually not threatening the state structures in any way. Actually, I see an inflation of the use of the term national security for those situations. So then, about the use of the term national security in the European context, the funny thing is, and that therefore I'm actually disappointed that the European Commission isn't here. the European Commission, when it puts forward legislative proposals, it's referring to national security a lot, all the time actually, in particular when it comes to legislation for counter-terrorism measures. And I've asked the Commission, I asked a written question even, saying, can you then explain to me what national security means? What is the definition? To what area does it apply? What competences does it create for whom? The answer of the Commission, no, national security is a purely national competence. Fine, indeed, that's what the treaty says. So can then somebody please explain to me how national security can possibly be the basis for EU legislation? In my view, that means that all this legislation lacks a proper legal base. And it goes even beyond that, because if you read the proposals carefully for legislation, but also for international agreements, I very often get the impression that national security actually refers to the national security of non-EU countries. In most cases, actually the United States. Now, I care very much about the security of American people, but this is about a legal definition and creating legal grounds for legislation that restricts the rights of citizens. So we have to be very, very careful. I mean, too often we are restricting the rights of European citizens for the purpose of protecting the national security of the United States or other countries, without any adequate democratic control. I think we should think about this very, very carefully. So I get the impression that national security is used as a kind of blanket justification, not as a legal term, but more as a kind of political notion, which then sort of justifies taking all sorts of measures. And that means that there is no legal certainty, there is no predictability of the law, and there is no, the rights and the protection of the citizens are sacrificed for a concept that is not defined. That means it's completely arbitrary, it's undermining democracy. And it may well be, as you said, that in many countries there are all sorts of legal arrangements in place for oversight and remedies or what have you. But we all know in practice that these legal instruments are extremely weak. And that brings me to the point of oversight. We have seen that oversight, even in the countries where there are arrangements which on paper look very good, in practice it is very, very weak and ineffective. And in some cases, I even wonder if those exercising the oversight actually are committed to their duty of really making sure that rights of citizens are not unduly limited. Sometimes you get the feeling that they are there to actually justify intervention by the security. You mentioned the intelligence services. Increasingly, this is also about regular policing. Huh? That's another worry that I have. It's blurred. Yes, I'm coming to a conclusion. So I think, and the point on oversight is my last point. We have seen, for example, in the European Parliament, we did an inquiry into the PRISM case and everything else that followed after, everything to do with surveillance. And we talked a lot with people who were supposed to exercise oversight over the activities of the intelligence services. And we noticed that in all those countries which you refer to as, where they've got it right, they actually did not get it right. Even the countries that we believe are the most civilized and democratic in the world do not get it right, at least not 100%. So we really need to invest, first of all, in a very, very restrictive definition, a common definition of the term national security. We need to hold the Commission to account a lot more when it's proposing legislation referring to national security. It has to be absolutely clear what that means, what the legal basis is, and the national security of what nation we are actually talking about. And then finally, I think one final point why this is also important, because, well, there was the case of Prakken de Oliveira and the interception, but we increasingly also see that even European leaders, think of Mr. Orban, who is labeling NGOs as his opponents and a threat to public security. I mean, we are on a slippery slope here. So I think we as citizens have to be a lot more critical. I mean, we're talking about fake news the whole time and alternative facts coming out of Russia, but we also have to be much more critical of our own governments and the European Commission and indeed the Council when they're using this term national security, and ask them exactly what is it that you mean. That is our duty as citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's going to be hard to quarrel with much of what has just been said. But I share Sophie's regret that at the very last minute the European Commission had to pull out. We're told because of some twist, the latest twist in Brexit. Brexit is being blamed for everything. I mean, soon it's going to be blamed for the weather. But hang on, we'll just have to move on and wait. And so, Florence, I mean, France has been a country where I have publicly gone on record in the same way. Not everything's perfect, but certainly some improvements have been made over the past 2 years. I was especially happy with, the universal right to privacy, right? And I've stated quite clearly that the practices which have been adopted in France for the Oversight Commission has assured me that it meets for 3 solid days a week, and it not only looks at oversight of internal. So they are committed. I'm convinced they're committed, Sophie. But one of the interesting developments we've seen is that the safeguards which are applied to domestic intelligence are in France also, at the request of the Prime Minister's office, being applied to external foreign intelligence. So on that note, Florence, how would you like to come in on the subject of national security? The CNIL has some competence, but not total competence. Would you like to share your insights on that?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. It's hard to talk after Sophie. I mean, she has such a strong leadership. And so I will try to keep your attention on with the subject on national security. Maybe before entering into the debate of today on this definition of national security and whether or not we need a definition at European level, let me first share some thoughts. First of all, I'm representing Isabelle Falque-Pierrotin that was supposed to be at the panel, and so she wanted to give you also some message. The first one is that we still hear a lot that privacy prevents from securing people. We continue to hear that privacy is in opposition to security, so it's privacy versus security. And we definitely don't think that's the right way to present things, and that in fact it's more a problem of balance between both. And so it's really where you put the cursor, where what kind, in fact, of guarantees needs to be put in place when we talk about national security. The more national security is, the more privacy guarantees we need. And so definition is definitely one of the guarantees. So to have a common definition will help to avoid the loophole and the divergence between member states and more generally at international level. But on other type of guarantees, I would like to take the opportunity to point you to a specific paper that was prepared, elaborated by the 28 data protection authorities. We call it the Essential Guarantees paper. It's a very, we think, very interesting and important paper. Why? Because we have analyzed back from the 70s all the text and especially the case law from the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, which is competent on this kind of subject, especially in matter of national security and surveillance. And so we did a thorough analysis, and we extracted from that 4 essential guarantees, which are the key principle that should be respected in the EU, but also outside the EU, when it's about using and processing European data, or data protected by the Charter and by the European law. And so let me just read those 4 essential guarantees. We like them because they are in fact quite simple. It's like a mantra. Based on clear, so the processing should be based on clear, precise, accessible rules, which usually means based on law, sufficiently clear and understandable for the individual. So it's about forcibility and understanding of the individuals of the rules. Secondly, the processing should be necessary and proportionate with respect to the legitimate objective pursued, and it should be demonstrated. In addition, an independent oversight mechanism should exist, which can be prior and after. And effective, and the 4th one is effective remedies, needs to be available for the individual, even with only suspicion with respect to surveillance activities. That's just those 4 essential guarantees that are absolutely fundamental, because they do not apply only to member states, but they also apply internationally. And an illustration of the application of those 4 essential guarantees is the work we have done on the Privacy Shield, where in fact we assessed the surveillance system in the US based on those 4 essential guarantees, especially in terms of national security and intelligence services. And it's really the powerful message from the judge, which is ruling on the Schrems case, meaning that those principles should apply also outside of Europe, if data from European citizens are concerned by national security processing by foreign public authority. And you were talking a little bit about e-evidence and the Microsoft case, and that's also more or less the same, always the same issue about getting access to European protected data by foreign public authorities. So we definitely think that those 4 essential guarantees should be also used in the work that Joe is right now doing at an international level, maybe also at a European level on some other aspect. So to finish on that topic, we have always called at the Working Party 29 for a global solution on that. It's true that there are a lot of difficulties and discussion at European Union level, but again, we need to see that a little bit also with a broader scope. And the Privacy Shield again is an example. What Joe is doing is we really support your work, and we think that it's very important in order to solve this problem of cooperation between public authorities at international level, also in the field of intelligence and surveillance. But also we want to mention the Convention 108 and the fact that it's covering also intelligence activities, and that would be also a potential solution in order to frame this kind of activities. So we have projects on the table. It's definitely a huge issue. Also, the partnership between the private sector and the public sector needs this kind of instrument in order to tackle the specific access. So just to say that the definition is one aspect. It's a very important one, because it can also create some kind of a weakness for the system. But again, we have also to try to see that from a broader point of view, especially on the geographical perimeter, and also find, if possible, an international solution. Thank you.
Yeah, let's bring together, as we open the floor to the audience, let's bring together two things said by our last lady speakers, right? One being the action of citizens and what citizens should do about it, and therefore, as I understand it, also citizens putting pressure on their politicians to take the right action about it. But also as to the actual state of European law. If we start off from Europe and then go on from the rest of the world. Because the four principles that Florence just referred to are already found entrenched in European law, and especially in Article 9 of the Council of Europe's Data Protection Convention, Convention 108, as it's often called. In other words, to put it simply, but hopefully clearly, you cannot gather data, personal data, for national security or state security purposes unless, one, you have a law which grants the power to do so, and that law contains adequate safeguards which are necessary and proportionate in a democratic society. Let's repeat that, in a democratic society, not in a tin pot dictatorship. And I think that these tests which a law must meet, these tests which the measures must meet, and which are also increasingly being discussed and taken up outside Europe, though never at the speed that people like myself would like them to see. And could I add one thing before I open the discussion to the floor? Sophie correctly said some governments don't get it, but we have to face the reality that there are some governments which don't want to get it, right? And there's a difference. Of course, we have governments which get it, some governments which are getting it, governments which don't get it, and some governments which don't want to get it, right? Yes, Sophie, why don't you come in? I see you trying to take the mic. So take the mic and have 30 seconds before we open to the floor.
Yeah, no, just, I mean, because even in those countries, or actually maybe specifically in those countries where all the legal, you know, all the boxes have been ticked that you set out, my problem is that the practice is very different. Because you mentioned France, for example. Well, I happen to have a case before the Conseil d'État now challenging the surveillance law. I can tell you that, you know, with all the safeguards and remedies and everything in place, the practice still looks very, very different. And that's the problem. We do, by using this, you know, loosely using this term of national security, you do create an area where there is potentially lawlessness. And there is, of course, I mean, also if I say practice, also look at the long history of the activities of secret services and democracy. I mean, they tend to derail. That's what they do. And they got almost free rein in the last 15 years, and every time with reference to this national security. And the actual remedies and oversight are extremely weak and ineffective in practice.
Well, Sophie, as I said, it is very much work in progress, right? I'm not contesting the fact that there has been a fairly elastic approach to oversight. That being said, over the past several years, we've got a mixture of two things coming in. On the one hand, I've seen lots of evidence for things being tightened up. Secondly, I've also seen lots of evidence for laws being written in a way to preserve elasticity. So therefore, my kind of proposal to the floor is that we are in a situation where there's a culture change which needs to take place. A culture change which needs to take place in the way that the state is going to be more transparent to talk about national security, a culture change in the way in which you are going to have to deploy forces for proper oversight of national security. And I'm saying this also in the light of something which we found to be quite successful. In my capacity as UN Special Rapporteur on Privacy, I've taken the initiative to invite all the oversight authorities of every state and create the International Intelligence Oversight Forum. And we put them in a room roughly this size, and I tried to get them to share good practices. And I'm pleased to say it's working, right? Slowly but surely. Now we're at 30 countries, 80 people, and next year we're going to be even more. So, as usual, is the bottle half full? Is the bottle half empty? Let's ask the audience. So, ladies and gentlemen, how many requests for the floor do we have? Okay, they're going up. So we're going to start with Mario, go to the gentleman in the red tie who also spoke yesterday, then go to our colleague from Göttingen. So, Mario.
Good morning. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to intervene. Since you started the debate on whether we are pessimistic or optimistic, I just wanted to say that after having completed a project on intelligence and fundamental rights upon the request of the Libe Committee and the Parliament, in fact, after the Libe inquiry on the NSA, I would tend to say one comment would be, even during the 3.5 years of the implementation of the project, we really noted quite a bit of an evolution. So I think in this discussion, I think it's very important to say which year are we talking about at this stage? What are the reforms? For example, France, 2015, major reform. Germany, 2016, important changes. UK, 2016, the Netherlands, 2017. I'm talking about, of course, the countries where there is a great intelligence capacity, and what we were looking at are the strengths of their oversight system. It is a bit difficult to say they are too weak at this stage because we need to see them in practice. But at least the positive thing, and I'll close on this, is really that the laws are much more detailed, so transparency is there. And secondly, I mean, an evolution. Secondly, the oversight are there. And what we can say with this example are basically a sort of a, maybe based on the 4 key principles, but in fact you need a bit more, and the FRA came out with 16 opinions, defining basically what should be done by the legislator in order to get it right, as you mentioned it. Sorry, it was not really a question, but I just wanted to re-emphasize that we need to be a bit balanced in the discourse. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mario. And in fact, one of the examples we see there is precisely that of France, where the law of 2015, I should say the 2 laws of 2015, the second law, for example, relating to foreign intelligence, in practice is being implemented in a way which is stronger than the law perceived. So my question there was, why don't you change the law? Why don't you make the law stronger too? And the answer I got was, well, that's a candidate for change in order to make things stronger. But please, go ahead, sir.
Tobias Morschutz from Datenschutzraum Germany. Please, before I ask my question, I want to thank Sophie for her inspiring text. And now to my question to Florence. You said about the balance between national security and privacy. For me, the question is if we not have, at least in this position, the first problem in the definition of national security, because we accept that there is a balance between national security and the fundamental right, which is the foundation for a free and democratic society, a free and democratic nation, that puts the fundamental rights are there to provide security. So it should be national security to also provide the fundamental rights. So is it right to take balance between national security and fundamental rights?
Okay. Florence, before you take the question, could I simply ask the gentleman from Göttingen first and then the lady who's standing there?
Thank you very much, Joe.
Forgive my eyesight.
My name is André Luc. I'm from the University of Göttingen. So thank you, everyone, for a very interesting panel. Especially my question is for Michiel Pestman. Thank you also for this very interesting case that you brought in the Netherlands to the court. And I think it's a good example for lawyers in many other countries on how to protect their rights. My attention was only drawn to this issue that you were tipped first of all, and that the government or the ministry confirmed that you were wiretapped, which is maybe a lucky thing. Maybe the lawyers in other countries won't have this confirmation or won't have this tip, but especially the confirmation. And then there will be a problem of standing maybe in quite a lot of countries. That's why I wanted to ask what you think, whether you would have the same chances of bringing the court to the case and maybe even winning it if you didn't have this confirmation from the government. So just a short answer maybe.
Thank you very much. We'll keep the answer for the end. Madam?
My name is Anne Roth. I worked in the German inquiry on mass surveillance for the past 3 years. And because of that, also I was focused very much on the German situation. And my question now is, Mr. Cannataci, you said that for oversight, it's important that it's independent and efficient, and I really like that description. And I'm wondering whether you actually see anywhere that type of oversight. My impression of the German law is that that's not being achieved, but I'm wondering if there is actually any good examples anywhere.
Okay, we'll start answering those questions. I'm just going to, since I have the microphone, I'm just going to very nippily come in on the last one. No, I don't think that the German situation is where I want it to be. I've asked the German government to meet with me to discuss the matter. It has accepted to do so, but that was before they decided to take a bit longer to have a new German government. So now waiting until the new German government comes in. There are, I think if Sophie was saying that no country has got it absolutely right, I would tend to agree with her. In fact, one of the reasons why we've been working on a draft legal instrument is to come up with those principles which would ensure that countries do get it right. Because there are many countries which have come to me and said, Joe, can you give us a law, something to use as a model? And the truth is, nobody's perfect. I haven't been able to come up and say that, follow the Dutch model, follow the French model, right? That being said, you do see new traits coming out and new good practices coming in. So once again, it would be work in progress. But let me stop there at this moment in time. Let me give the floor over to, I think it was first Florence, then Michiel, and then I'll ask the panelists to conclude, because soon that famous bell will come in and ring.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm not sure I got your question, but I think that the problem is whether, in fact, we should just talk about privacy versus security and not just to talk about just privacy. To be honest, I think that, we need to be conscious about what's going on outside, and to be in the real life with the terrorist attacks. So, you need, at a certain point, to have this kind of discussion between privacy versus security. The question is really, how do you balance both, not on to have only a security matter that will take over privacy?
One short, my opinion is privacy is part of security. So you cannot balance it with security because it's part of security.
Okay. And also, maybe just to say very briefly about Mario's points. It's true that you might need a little bit more than 4 essential guarantees, but that was also the idea to have easy to understand principle that can be maybe developed at an international level. So that was also the idea of having those 4 essential guarantees.
Michiel, would you like to come in response to the question that was directed at you?
Yeah, of course. Well, it's even in the Netherlands, which has a very efficient intelligence service, information occasionally comes out. This morning there was a large article in the newspaper about the Dutch intelligence services helping the Americans to establish or to find the Russian interference in the elections. Whether that was an intentional leak or not, I don't know. But even in the Netherlands, sometimes information comes out about the work of the intelligence services. And we heavily rely upon those sources to do our work. I must say that I was surprised that the minister acknowledged that we had been tapped for a certain period of time and quite extensively. And I think that it would have been very difficult to go to court without that admission. So in a way, the Dutch government has created this, its own problem by admitting that we were being tapped. Because I was expecting, to be honest, I was expecting the minister to say that he was not allowed to reveal anything because of state security, but he did. And I am in a way grateful for the minister for doing that.
Yeah, before I ask Iain to make his concluding remarks, could I just point out one of the realities? I'm going to ask Sophie to come before that too. One of the realities we have, and let's stick at Europe, but of course we could take the discussion more globally. So I work with a lot of secret services for a number of reasons, and I try to get them to comment, and I try to get them to give their insights, because as Sophie said, we all want to be secure. It's just we want to make sure that we don't sacrifice our fundamental liberties in the name of security. And I tend to agree with the gentleman. I don't believe that you should talk of balance between security and privacy. I think you should talk of synergy between security and privacy. You know, I come from the generation which believed in Queen and I want it all. Yes, I want it all. I want to have privacy and I want to have security. And I believe we are intelligent enough to get to that. Because the term balance, Florence, kind of suggests that if you have a little bit more security, you can have a little bit less privacy, no? Which is not what you want to say. But let me just remind you one thing as to how difficult it is to achieve this and give you a tiny case study. Well, in Paris, we were having a discussion, 60 people, where I managed to get 2 people from the Dutch intelligence services to explain the new law, and we made a matrix where it has improved and what the problems were with the new one. And put this in context, ladies and gentlemen, right? If I had to put on my Dutch hat for a minute, I would say, you know, the secret services in the Netherlands, a country of 17 million or so, and the secret services between 2,000 and 3,000 people. The moral of the story is, even had the law in the Netherlands been 100% good, and it's not, right? It is an improvement, but it's not 100% where I would want it to be. Can you take the same law, just imagine it were 100% good, and transplant it to other countries? And the answer is no. Just for the reasons which have just been pointed out by Michiel. Because in the Netherlands, the culture is so critical, happily, right, that the people inside the secret services themselves won't tolerate certain things being done. The cultural change has begun. It's not where Sophie might want it to be or where I want it to be, but it's begun. The point that I was going to make, moral of the story, is this. During that session in Paris, somebody dug me in the ribs, an ex-secret service operator from another European state, which has 23 million people and 23,000 people in its secret services. And let's make no secret about it, it was a country of Central and Eastern Europe, and that person said, the Dutch law won't work in my country because the culture isn't there yet. And I think if you take that simply as an example of a difficulty inside Europe, let alone how bigger the problem is across the world with the great variety we have, 190 countries. Sophie and then Iain.
No, I was triggered by a couple of things. And firstly, you say it's a matter of culture. Yeah, there are different national traditions, that's true, but it's also a matter of, but I think what they say, you know, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely applies to everybody anywhere in the world. Okay, I think it's human nature. And that applies even to the Netherlands. And I remember, and yes, this is a couple of years ago, you said it, things may have changed over time. But when we were doing the inquiry in the European Parliament, we spoke also to the chair of the Dutch oversight body. And by then it had been revealed that the Dutch secret services were applying or were using practices that were illegal. There was no legal base. And we asked the chair of the oversight body, and he said, yeah, well, I know that it's illegal, but we're actually in the process of revising the law, so it will be legal soon. Sorry, but how am I supposed to have confidence in somebody who has such an understanding of his task? You know, that makes it very difficult. Also, you said, but the law has been improved because the laws have changed and the legal base is better. No, I think a lot of illegal practices have simply been legalized in the meantime. And if I look at how the European Commission and the member state governments and even some groups in the European Parliament completely and utterly disregard the rulings by the European Court of Justice, you know, then I think, okay, trust is good, control is better. I do not trust them. And then, on the understanding of the task, the point is also that every time you listen to the political debate, also at national level, oversight, and this is maybe also something that has changed after 9/11, but oversight is seen as an obstacle for national security and for intelligence services. They don't see it as an integral part of the system, they see it as the enemy almost. You know, and that's why independence of oversight bodies is so important. But again, if you look at practice, and I'll conclude on this because I'll come back to the French law. You said, oh, but the French law has changed and there are all these safeguards now. Well, I'm actually, as I said, I have this case before the Conseil d'État. I have no clue what the outcome will be, but we're testing that system. And what I see so far, let me be very cautious in my conclusions, but let's say that there's still a few small hurdles, okay? If you're a single individual citizen and you want to use the remedies and the avenues available, well, they'll make it as difficult as possible for you. I have to say the knowledge of French legalese has improved considerably in the last 2 years. And the last thing I'll say is that the European Parliament has, to my great joy and pride, adopted an amendment of ours for the creation of a litigation fund at European level that will allow individuals, NGOs, whoever wants to litigate cases that may create case law at European level in the area of fundamental rights and the rule of law can apply for that fund. We're going to talk about the modalities soon, because I think democracy is also about checks and balances, about powers and countervailing powers, and we need to strengthen the hand of citizens, I think.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Iain, you have the closing words.
I'm going to finish, as befits this session, not with answers, but with questions. But you'll be relieved to hear they're rhetorical questions. Why is the CCBE involved in this whole field? Why do lawyers care? Of course, why do citizens care? I'd submit that what it's really fundamentally about is the maintenance of the rule of law. That what any society cannot be governed and run by arbitrary power. That's why we have the whole complex of international agreements and conventions I referred to in my opening remarks. But they have to be enforced. And the area which I think national security poses the greatest threat to the rule of law is the very inspecific, it means whatever you want it to mean, sense in which governments look at national security. It was said by one of our colleagues that, well, really, privacy law is part of security law. Would that were so? I respectfully disagree. Yes, the privacy of the individual is a fundamental right, just as the security of the individual is a fundamental right. But the European Court of Human Rights is well familiar with the idea that you sometimes have to balance these rights against one another. It's got a very coherent balancing in terms of Article 8, and in Article 6 it correctly asserts there is no balancing. The fair trial a trumps all. So what are we worried about? Well, if you have a specific exemption, viz. National security, and you take the view that the UK government did, there's a logical fallacy in the answer I gave you. Defining a national security doesn't restrict the ability of governments to deal with new and evolving threats. The question is, under the rule of law, what is a new and evolving threat? Is it a threat to national security? If the answer is yes, then pursue it with all vigor. If the answer is no, then I'm sorry. It doesn't fall in the exception. It's why the CCBE is sufficiently concerned that it intervened in the Prakken case. It's why we published our recommendations on the protection of client confidentiality within the context of surveillance activity. There's been a copy in your seats, you can pick one up later. That's why we've put in subsidiary papers. It's why we've intervened in the French case. It's why we've intervened in Poland. And it's why only last week I signed off on our amicus curiae brief to the United States Supreme Court in the United States against Microsoft case. At the end of the day, we're worried about this, we're concerned about this, because for a democratic society to live and to thrive, it cannot do so other than under the rule of law, and a law which protects the fundamental rights that all citizens have come to expect. Slightly facetious point, I don't buy the proposition that the way to protect our ancient rights is to abrogate them all. But on a more fundamental point, I'd come up with the words of Lord Denning, who very famously said, anent the rule of law, be you ever so high, the law is above you. And on that thought, enjoy lunch.
Thank you very much.